Welcome everyone to our Packers News Camp Chat virtually alongside Pete Dougherty. I am Olivia Reiner. The Packers begin their first real activity of training camp this week with the acclimation period, which will include some walkthroughs as well as some strength and conditioning. Before that week begins, today we heard from quarterback Aaron Rodgers and defensive lineman Kenny Clark. Before we get into some of their comments, I want to remind you can be a part of our conversation as always. You can head down to the Facebook comments or the YouTube comments, leave us a question, a thought that you're having, and Pete and I will address some of those toward the end of our discussion today. Pete, let's just get started by talking about some of the points that Aaron Rodgers hit on today in his media availability. We know, and the players know, everybody knows that the coronavirus has altered and will continue to alter the way that the roster is constructed this season. The Packers at the moment only have 3 quarterbacks on their roster, 3 very
another team just this morning and asked him, if you were running a team, what would you do? And he said, as of now, they're not. But it's a big deal because, if you don't have a good quarterback in this league, you don't have much chance. And with how, as we've seen with baseball and the Cardinals and the Marlins, how fast this could spread. I mean, if it shot through a quarterback room, what do you do?
It's a good question, Pete. Matt LaFleur has said that the Packers are going to have to be flexible regardless of whatever happens, and they'll adjust day to day depending on what is going on with the virus. Looking ahead at training camp, the Packers won't officially be practicing in pads till about August 16th, which means they're only going to have about 3 weeks of padded practice. Today, Aaron Rodgers said that they're going to have a lot to accomplish as a team once they're able to get out on the field and in their pads. What challenges are going to come with having an abbreviated on-field live session this preseason?
Yeah, it was just, as you and I were talking about what we were going to talk about here, I was just thinking about that. And, they also get the several days of where they're just be out there and the only padding they'll be wearing is helmets, basically. I think it's 4 or 5 days of that. I think what they're going to miss is what they've already missed in the off season, because there's a lot of reps in those practices where they can, just really basic learning the fundamentals of each play. But, if you think about it, they get 14 padded practices, and I think it's like maybe 18 total with just in the helmets. And in a normal camp, it's usually, we get those schedules, you count up the practices, it's usually about, 20 or so, 21. And several of those always end up being non-padded too. And once you start playing preseason games, a decent chunk of those practices, the day or two leading up to the game, are doing game planning stuff for the preseason game, and the backups are getting a decent amount of those reps as you get closer and closer to the game. So, this is why Rodgers always says he thinks practice is more valuable than the preseason games are for him and for the starting offense, because they get more done in practice because they don't play in the games. So you could argue that in these 14 practices, they can get a lot done with the starters if they give the starters a lot of the reps. Now that hurts the evaluations of younger guys, but they can probably do a lot of that. So they can accrue a decent amount of reps and get a lot done. So I think the thing they're going to have missed most is the off-season work, where you just get a chance to run through the plays without pads over and over again. 3 weeks of OTAs basically, and then a mini camp. They missed all those practices.
Definitely going to be challenging, trying to figure out who is going to be taking the majority of these reps heading in to the start of the regular season. Let's move on to discussing defensive lineman Kenny Clark, who's entering a very important year in his contract. Our PackersNews.com reporter Jim Ozarski wrote a really great piece on Clark and where his head's at heading into his contract year over on PackersNews.com. I highly suggest you check it out. Clark is among a number of 2021 free agents, including left tackle David Bakhtiari, running back Aaron Jones, cornerback Kevin King, and center Corey Linsley. Keeping all of them on the team is going to be a mighty challenge for the Packers this upcoming season. Salary cap is reportedly going to be set at a minimum of $175 million next season. That does not include whatever rollover the Packers would have coming out of this season. At the moment, they have about $13 million in cap space that could roll over to next season if they decide not to use it on anyone this season. How likely is it that the Packers and Kenny Clark are able to come to a long-term deal before, during, or after this 2020 season, Pete?
I would think that he and Bakhtiari would be really high priorities. Left tackles with Bakhtiari are really hard to find. He's as good as anybody in the league. And defensive linemen are the most important defensive players. And Clark is a really, really good one. And I think I don't have it in front of me. He's either 23 or just turned 24, I think. I mean, he's super young for a guy who's already played 4 years in the league. So I would think the odds are really high that they'll find a way, even with the limitations, with the cap being at 175 or wherever it ends up, where it was supposed to be probably in the low, 220 or somewhere in there. That's a big difference. They're going to have to shed some roster and guys they would have normally kept. But I would think those two guys are really high priorities to keep. And Clark, especially because of that, he's just so young and already a really, really good player.
Clark is a very important part of the Packers' front line on defense there. A big topic of conversation ever since that NFC Championship loss against the San Francisco 49ers is the Packers' run defense and the fact that they allowed almost 300 rushing yards and on 42 carries from the San Francisco 49ers. How can Clark and the rest of the run defense improve heading into this 2020 season?
Yeah, that was just a total and complete disaster in the biggest game of the year. The run defense had been an issue all season. I think a lot of it has to do with Mike Pettine's approach. I mean, part of it is justifiable. It's a passing game. If you don't stop the pass, you can't win in this league. But you can't just completely ignore the run, or you get run over like the Packers did against the 49ers, where they didn't even have a chance in that game and never got a handle on the 49ers run game there. So I think it's as much on the coaching staff as it is on the players, and deciding how they're going to play and how much freedom to give the guys up front, because they really want those guys to, and Pettine even said it again this offseason, he still wants them to shoot gaps or get into the backfield and be disruptive. And, you can make big plays that way, but you also sometimes leave yourself open to wide holes. And you could, we saw that in San Francisco from our vantage point in the press box. You remember we were in the corner of the end zone there, and you could just see those holes, how wide they were, and Breida just fly right through them. So I think it's as much up to the coaching staff as it is to the players, and maybe mixing up their personnel a little more and maybe not playing so much time, which, Clark was asked about. And I think Matt LaFleur might have been asked about it yesterday too, or I think Gutekunst, one of the two.
We'll see exactly how they decide to approach their personnel decisions, how exactly they decide to approach the run defense heading into some of these initial games this upcoming season. Let's move on to some questions from some of our lovely viewers. I want to remind you guys, everyone, please use appropriate language in the chat. Be kind to each other. No fighting down there. And I also want to, before we get into our chat questions, I also want to head to actually a DM that I got and remind you that if you have a question and you're not able to get on the stream live and in person, you can always try to send those questions to me. My email is in my Twitter bio. You can DM me, and I'm always happy to consider some questions that you have in advance. First, so I'll start with Katie's question. She reached out to me in advance and wanted to know a little bit more about how this media availability situation has been working for all of us this season. What's interesting, and if you've been following along on Packers News or over on the Packers website, we're doing all of these availabilities by Zoom. She wanted to know, is there a particular order that we're asking questions? Are we sending in questions in advance? She also wants to know what exactly access is going to look like after the games. These are all really good questions, and they're questions that Pete and I have had to think about a lot. There is no order that we know of necessarily, Pete. I think they just call on us based on when we get into the queue in Zoom. We have to raise our hands in Zoom, and we do not submit questions in advance. We ask them there on the spot. And my understanding is that these virtual press conferences over Zoom are going to continue as games begin. However, my guess is that they're not going to be as robust as in-person availability would be after a game, where we're able to grab a bunch of players after the game and talk to them. They're all going to be pre-selected and handed to us essentially by the Packers. Pete, do you have anything else you'd like to add about what this process is going to be like?
No, that's about right. It's a loss for, it's not like it's just a loss for reporters. It's a loss for people who follow the game and want to read about it, because you do pick up information when you go in the locker room, and you might just catch a guy as he's walking out, and you have time to ask him a couple really detailed questions. It helps fill out stories as far as adding really important detail. So, we're gonna lose some of that, and you're not gonna find exclusive quotes in any publication. So it's going to be the analysis. We're going to have to do a lot of our own analysis, and so that's why PackersNews.com will be worth signing up for, right?
Yeah, we mentioned this yesterday too. Only so many media members are going to be allowed to be at practices this season, especially this training camp as well. We know that we will be a part of that small group. So if you're not already subscribed to PackersNews.com, why not start? There's always a good deal somewhere if you go over there and you can check it out. I'll also take this question next from Nolan. Thank you, Katie, for asking that question. Nolan wants to know how the COVID reserve list works. Does that mean a player is opted out for the season or only for a certain amount of time? So I think my understanding here, Nolan, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. So the COVID reserve list is different from the opt-out list. So Devin Funchess, Packers wide receiver, is the only player that we know of at the moment who has decided to opt out for the 2020 season due to coronavirus concerns. It is conceivable that more players this week could opt out. It sounds like the deadline is somewhere around the end of this week, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. That date keeps shifting because the NFL and the NFLPA need to come to an agreement first. But at the moment, Funchess is the only one who has opted out. And I believe, Pete, that it is a permanent decision that Funchess cannot opt to come back at some point during the season. The COVID reserve list, however, on the other hand, is the list that a player is put on if they've either tested positive for coronavirus or they've come into contact with somebody who has tested positive. So it doesn't necessarily mean that the player himself has tested positive. Currently, there are 5 Packers players on that list, including tight end Jay Sternberger and kicker Mason Crosby. Long snapper Hunter Bradley was added to that list today. Defensive lineman Trayvon Hester is on that list, and outside linebacker Greg Roberts is the 5th person on that list. Those 5 players do not count against or among the active roster. So technically, at the moment, the Packers roster stands at about 80 players. So those are the distinctions between the opt-out versus the reserved COVID-19 list. Pete, is there anything else you'd like to add?
I'm not sure if you remember the details or not. I'd have to look it up. But I think if you were around someone who had COVID, then I think you have to sit for, is it 5 days, but if you actually have it yourself, you have to sit for, I can't remember the exact, like maybe 10 days. And then in either instance, you have to test negative. I think it's 2 days in a row before you can rejoin the team. Those numbers are probably not exactly right, but they're in the ballpark of how long a player has to sit if he's on that list, depending on which of the 2 reasons that he's on the list.
Mm-hmm. Also worth noting that if you're symptomatic versus asymptomatic, there's different protocols for that too. So there's a lot of different rules right now, and we can share some more information over on social media if you're curious to learn a little bit more. Thank you very much for that question. We'll move on to Carlton. Carlton asks, are the players being separated right now by groups such as offensive players, rookies, etc.? We know that right now the NFL has not allowed more than 80 players in the facility at once. The Packers are technically over that. They were, at least as of a few hours ago. However, now technically they are under 80. That being said, they have decided to try to mix it up a little bit and not have the entire group in the facility at once for sake of safety. So I think it's a good question. My understanding, they're being separated pretty drastically with their meeting rooms. Their typical meeting rooms in the building are now being shaken up a little bit. They're a little bit more spread out. As I mentioned on yesterday's live stream, the offensive line room is now what was the media auditorium is now the offensive line room. Things are a little bit different. And Tom kind of joked that perhaps the chairs in the media auditorium would not be very comfortable for offensive linemen. I don't know if you agree.
Yeah, well, those are big people, and they're squeezed together a little bit. Yeah, because that's the position that has the most guys. It's just kind of piecing together a little bit of what Kenny Clark was saying. It sounds like when they have a team meeting or an offense or defense meeting, they do it in the Crick, which is it's not the Hudson Center, that's their full indoor practice facility, but it's the indoor practice facility that's attached to the building. And it's a small field where they do walkthroughs and things like that. And it sounds, but it's still, a really big room. It's probably the size of a gym, I would guess. And so they can spread everybody out in that. So it sounds like if they have a team meeting or for sure just offense or defense, they're meeting in there. And otherwise, like he said, the defensive linemen are still meeting in their regular meeting room, but they're just more spread out now and wearing masks, which they obviously weren't doing before.
The day-to-day is changing quite a bit, and that's just what we know now. Things are going to continue to change as the season rolls on, and of course, PackersNews.com will have all of the info you need to know as we head into this very different, interesting season. That is going to do it for us today, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll be back throughout the week to do more live streams and to connect with all of you. For Pete, I'm Olivia. We'll see you next time.